This video is sort of a clarification on some things that have been running around online about the historical nature of the Oriate or Oba title in the Lukumi tradition. Just some things that are being passed off as truth and not a lot of historical accuracy. But, like all things internet, you repeat it long enough, people start believing it, and then repeating it and teaching it to their godchildren. So the one specific thing I want to address in this video is that Oriate is a made-up title. It doesn't exist, and that in Africa there was never anything similar to the Oriate, and then there's another subversion of this argument that actually the Babalao, the Ifa initiates, were the ones who were actually doing all the work that Oriates do today, and the only reason the Oriate exists is because in Cuba there weren't enough Babalaos, so some Orisha priest decided to take matters in their own hands, make up a title. It's a pretty pejorative theory with really no factual base, and so I'm just going to go over some of the details on why it's not factual. So the only part of everything I just said that happens to be true is that the name Oriate does not seem to be the title of any one particular type of priest in Africa. Nothing I've come across with. But that in itself is not a deal breaker, right? Because everything else that I just mentioned is actually false. So now question, just because the actual title of Oriate, we can't seem to find it, does that invalidate the entire premise of what an Oriate is? And I would argue that, just to paraphrase Shakespeare, I don't read enough Shakespeare to quote verbatim, but what's in a name, a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet, right? So then the question is, can we look at what the Oriate is doing, and instead of looking for the name Oriate in traditional African religion, can we find people who were doing more or less or exactly the same thing that the Oriate does, and conclude that just the only thing that changed was the name, or maybe a couple of other things? And on that I say yes. I say that if you look at traditional African religion, you are actually flooded, inundated with examples of priests acting in similar function to what the Oriate in Cuba does. And it's in fact it's a no-brainer. And so I'm going to give a little bit of background on the two different systems, how the systems changed, and why a new title essentially had to be created in Cuba for it to work. If you had simply limited yourself to the old, I don't want to say old like it's outdated, because it's not, but to the way the traditional Yoruba were, the whole recreation of the religion in a foreign land wouldn't have worked out, right? So the creation of the Oriate was pretty important. So essentially, for those of you not too familiar with traditional African Yoruba version, you have shrines and temples dedicated to individual Oricha, right? So you'll have a temple to Shango, and everybody who's a priest in that temple is actually initiated to Shango. They may or may not have other Orisha, but if they're in the Shango shrine, they have Shango. Okay? Just like if you're in the Batala, if you consider a priest of a Batala, it's because you underwent full initiation into a Batala ritual there. And within every shrine or temple, you have designated priests, right, who are installed. Oftentimes, they're installed for life, and they have very specific functions, right? and the titles of the and sometimes they're different. They're different. The titles for one Orisha may be different for the titles of the priest of another Orisha, right? So the most well-known and the famous one that everybody has access to here in the diaspora is Ifa, right? So everybody, a lot of people know that the Ifa temple of Oketasi, Leife, has 16 principal officers, right? And I don't know them all offhand, but I know a few. You have the Araba, you have the Akoda, you have the Aseda, you have an Agbongbong, and many more to reach your 16 titles, and those titles have his history with that Orisha, right? So you wouldn't expect for the Obatala shrine to also have an Araba, and also to have an Akoda, and also have an Aseda, right? Because that's not the history of that Orisha. So when you go to the Obatala shrine in the same city, Ileife, right? You have the chief Obatala priest, which is the Obalesun. And then you have the, I think next in line is the Obalale. Okay. Then you have the Lorikang. And you have all these titles that are specific to that Orisha. Okay. If you go to different towns, you'll find various titles. I know one of the chief priestesses of Yemaja. I don't remember if it's the Oyo region. She would be called the Yeye Tolokun. Don't know why she's named a Tolokun if she's a Yemaya priestess. So I'm just telling you what I know so far. There is a Olokun priest in Lagos, chief priest. He's called the Aworo Olokun. And he's in charge of the Kauri divination and the main initiations of the shrine and the temple. And mind you, they're not the only ones that can perform rituals, right? Like, you can go to a qualified priest and they can initiate you. But when it comes to the rituals that happen in the shrine, in the main shrine, these chief priests have titles and they have their roles and their responsibilities. Well, you notice I've been mentioning titles related to specific shrines to specific Orisha. As you know, one of the most significant changes that happened in Cuba were that the priesthood of many Orisha were consolidated into a single priesthood. So this is something that's unprecedented, essentially, right? The harshness of slavery and persecution forced these changes. They forced, that when somebody was initiated to Obatala, they also received authority to act in a priestly capacity for Chun, Yemaya, Shango, Legba, Ogun, Ochosi. Okay? And so this is a new dynamic. It was never seen before. There was no really a precedent for it, right? So you have these shrines. Shrines don't exist anymore, and you have the Orisha that's more or less mobile, right? As opposed to in Africa, where you have dedicated shrines that have been there for literally hundreds, if not thousands of years. Except for the cabildos in Cuba, you don't have that. You have every individual priest's home becoming a shrine at the temple, and that could be temporary. People move. It's a very different dynamic. And so, instead of having an Aworo Olokun and Mogba, M-O-G-B-A, instead of, in Cuba they say Oba, but in Igboho, which is Oyo-derived, or Oyo-style Shango, the Igboho shrine, you have the Mogba, which is the chief priest of Chango. He does the Kauri divination. He heads up the initiations at the shrine. So just like you have every santero, every olorisha, who can now perform rituals for all these orishas at one time, you have essentially a chief priest these designated chief priests who have the authority to officiate, to be, the word that gets used a lot in English now is master of ceremonies, right? And that's where the word, MC comes from, right? The guy who leads a party or conference, we may call him the host, the MC, the master of ceremonies, is now the Oriate. So he, in a way, now it's usually a he. Back in the early days of Cuba, there were plenty of female Oriates. But the Oriate essentially became the sit-in for these chief priests for the individual shrines, right? They did Kauri divination for the Orishas that are Kauri Orishas.